I noticed something the moment my son-in-law walked into my kitchen for the first time. It wasn't anything I could name right away, just a feeling, the kind that sits quiet in your chest and waits. His name was Patrick. He had dark hair, an easy smile, and the kind of handshake that was just a little too firm for someone meeting his girlfriend's mother. My daughter Elise had been dating him for 7 months before she brought him home to our house in Bozeman. 7 months. And in all that time, she'd told me almost nothing about him, just that he was kind, that he made her laugh, and that she thought she might be in love. I wanted to believe all of it. Elise was 34. She'd spent her 20s building a career in physical therapy and most of her 30s taking care of me after her father passed. She deserved someone good. She deserved everything. So when Patrick walked through my door that Sunday afternoon in October, I made his favorite meal even though I didn't know what it was, and I smiled and I said, "It's wonderful to finally meet you." He looked around my kitchen the way people do when they're calculating square footage. I told myself I was imagining it. My husband Gerald had died 4 years earlier, not long after he retired. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We'd been married 38 years, and in that time we'd built something I was proud of. Not flashy, not the kind of wealth you'd see on television, but solid and real. Gerald was a civil engineer. I taught high school chemistry for 26 years. We lived carefully. We saved. We paid off the house early. Gerald had also made smart investments over the decades, index funds mostly, some bonds, a rental property we'd bought in the 90s that had appreciated more than either of us expected. When he died, the estate passed to me. Our financial advisor had helped us set up everything correctly, trusts, beneficiary designations, the works. Gerald had been meticulous about it. He used to joke that he wanted everything so airtight that even a team of lawyers couldn't find a crack. I think about that now, and I'm grateful for it in ways I can't fully express. The rental property alone was worth about $340,000. Our investment portfolio sat around $1.2 million. The house was paid off. I lived quietly. I volunteered at the library twice a week. I had a garden I loved, and I was, by any honest measure, comfortable. I'd told Elise about all of this when Gerald died. I wanted her to understand what she would inherit someday, what we had built and why it mattered. She'd listened carefully and then said, "Mom, that's yours, it's for your life." She hadn't brought it up since. Patrick, however, brought it up the very first time he sat in my kitchen. It happened casually. We were eating. He was asking questions the way people do when they're trying to make conversation. How long had I lived in the house? Did I find it hard to manage on my own? What did I do before retirement? All normal enough. And then, in the same easy tone, he asked, "So is this your only property, or do you have others?" I said we had a rental home on the other side of town. He nodded. "Smart investment. Real estate in Montana has really appreciated." "It has," I said. He asked where it was located. He asked whether I used a property management company or handled it myself. He asked what it was currently renting for and whether I'd ever considered selling. I answered. I don't know why I answered everything so readily. Maybe because Elise was watching and I wanted things to go smoothly. Maybe because he asked it all in such a natural, interested way that it didn't feel like interrogation until later, when I was washing the dishes alone and replaying the conversation in my head. By the time he left that evening, Patrick knew the rough location of my rental property, that I managed it myself, that it had been rented to the same family for 6 years, and that I had no plans to sell. He'd learned all of that in one dinner. I told myself he was probably just making conversation. That's what people do. They ask questions. But I didn't sleep well that night. The second visit was 3 weeks later. Elise brought him for Thanksgiving. My neighbor Beverly came too, and her husband Frank, which helped diffuse things a little. Patrick was charming at the table, helped clear plates, complimented my stuffing, made Beverly laugh twice. I was starting to think my initial impression had been unfair. Then, after dinner, while Elise and Beverly were in the kitchen and Frank had fallen asleep in the armchair, Patrick asked if I'd ever thought about downsizing. I said the house suited me fine. He said he understood, but that a house this size must be a lot to maintain alone, especially in the Montana winters. He said he'd seen some really lovely senior communities in the area, nice ones, not depressing at all, and that a lot of people found them a relief after years of upkeep. I was 63 years old. I shoveled my own walk. I planted a vegetable garden every spring. I was not, by any stretch, in need of a senior community. I said politely that I wasn't interested. He nodded and smiled and changed the subject, but something in me had shifted. That quiet feeling in my chest had gotten heavier. Elise called me the next day. She sounded happy. She said Patrick had really enjoyed meeting everyone and that he thought I was wonderful. She said almost offhandedly that he'd mentioned what a beautiful home I had. I said, Elise, how much does he know about your father's estate? She was quiet for a moment. I mean, I've mentioned it. I didn't give him numbers or anything. Why? No reason, I said. I was just curious, but I knew then that I needed to pay closer attention. I started keeping a mental log. It sounds extreme, I know, but something in me, call it 30 years of teaching teenagers to spot when someone was trying to cheat, call it instinct, call it grief still making me hypervigilant, told me to write things down. So I did. A small spiral notebook I kept in the drawer of my bedside table. Every question Patrick asked about the house, the rental, my finances, my health. Every comment about downsizing or assisted living. Every casual remark that seemed designed to test how much information I'd give. By February, I had 4 pages. He'd asked Elise's sister Megan during a birthday dinner I hadn't attended whether our father had left just the one property or whether there was more to the estate. Megan had told me about it afterward, laughing it off as awkward small talk. I did not laugh it off. He'd asked me during a January visit whether I had a financial advisor I trusted or whether I managed things myself. When I said I had an advisor I'd worked with for 15 years, he said, "That's great." Though sometimes a second opinion can be really valuable, especially after a major life change like losing a spouse. He mentioned, just in passing, that he had a colleague who did estate planning and financial consulting, very reputable, very thorough. I said I'd keep that in mind. I called my financial advisor the next morning and told her everything. Her name is Sandra, and she has known me for 20 years. She didn't say I was overreacting. She said, let's make sure everything is structured so that no one outside your immediate family can access, influence, or claim any part of your estate without going through significant legal channels. We spent 2 hours on the phone. By the end, we'd updated my trust documents, moved several accounts into a more protected structure, and I'd changed 2 passwords. I didn't tell Elise any of this. I didn't want to alarm her, and I didn't yet have anything concrete to point to. What was I going to say? That her boyfriend asked too many questions about real estate? Then March came, and everything changed. I found out by accident, the way you find out most important things. I had a routine appointment with my doctor, Dr. Henson, who had been my physician for 12 years. His receptionist called to confirm and mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd had a call the previous week from someone identifying himself as my daughter's partner, asking general questions about my health status and whether I had any cognitive concerns they should be aware of. I sat with that for a long moment. He wasn't authorized to ask anything, I said. No, she said carefully. He wasn't. And Dr. Henson didn't share any information. But I thought you should know. I thanked her and hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 15 minutes. My hands were in my lap. I was thinking about what it would mean for someone to call my doctor asking about my cognitive health. I was thinking about power of attorney. I was thinking about competency hearings. I was thinking about all the cases I'd read over the years, articles, news stories, about elderly people whose assets had been quietly moved out from under them by people they trusted. I was not going to be one of those people. I called my attorney that afternoon. Her name is Patricia Webb, and she has a particular expertise in elder law. I told her everything, the questions, the dinner conversations, the financial advisor suggestion, the call to Dr. Henson. She was quiet and careful and thorough. What you're describing could be the early stages of undue influence, she said. It may not rise to criminal behavior yet, but it's a pattern worth documenting. Keep the notebook. Don't confront him. Don't tip your hand. And if anything changes, if he makes any concrete move toward your finances or your documents, call me immediately. I did not tell Elise. I want to explain that decision because I've thought about it many times since. Elise loved him. She genuinely loved him. I watched her with him. She was lighter around him, funnier, more at ease. And what did I have? A notebook, some questions, a phone call to a doctor. If I went to her with that, she would wonder whether grief had made me suspicious of everyone. She would tell me Patrick was just curious. She would feel caught between us, and I was not willing to do that to her until I was certain, so I waited. April, Patrick proposed. Elise called me crying, happy crying, and I congratulated her. I listened to her describe the proposal, a small dinner, a ring he'd designed with a sapphire because she'd always said diamonds felt impersonal. She was so happy. I said all the right things. I said he sounded wonderful and I couldn't wait to celebrate. After I hung up, I opened my notebook. I wrote, engagement. Move carefully. They set the wedding for September. 8 months away. I had 8 months to figure out what, exactly, Patrick was planning and what I was going to do about it. I want to be honest, there were weeks when I wondered if I was wrong. He would come to dinner and be genuinely warm, help with the dishes, ask about my garden, remember small things I'd mentioned. Elise was happy in a way I hadn't seen her in years. There were nights I looked at my notebook and thought, maybe this is just a man who is curious about his future family's finances because he wants to understand what he's marrying into. Maybe that's normal. But then he would ask another question or make another comment, and the feeling in my chest would come back. In June, Megan pulled me aside after a family dinner. She'd been quieter than usual all evening, and I could tell something was bothering her. She said Patrick had approached her separately about something he called a family estate planning opportunity. He'd said he knew someone who could help reorganize assets more efficiently, especially for estates that cross generations. He'd suggested it might benefit everyone, me, Elise, Megan, if things were consolidated and optimized before the wedding. Megan had been polite but non-committal. She said, "Mom, what is he actually after?" I told her everything. She sat very still. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to keep letting him think you might be interested. I need to know what he proposes." She nodded. She didn't flinch. She called me 2 weeks later and told me Patrick had suggested that if the family pooled its assets into a joint trust with a financial manager he could recommend, they could avoid certain tax complications and probate delays. He'd floated the idea as though he were doing us a favor. He'd mentioned almost casually that his contact typically handled accounts over $1 million and could accommodate multiple beneficiaries. He knew the approximate size of my estate. He'd been piecing it together for months. I called Patricia Webb that night and told her everything. She said, "This is enough to involve law enforcement if something concrete happens. But right now, the clearest thing we can do is make sure that no mechanism exists by which he could access or influence your estate." We reviewed everything again. She helped me draft a letter, notarized, that outlined my cognitive fitness and the intentional structure of my estate, essentially a legal document that would undercut any future attempt to claim I'd been confused or incapacitated when making financial decisions. I also hired a private investigator. I don't feel embarrassed about that. I felt I needed facts, not impressions. The investigator, a quiet woman named Dale who had recommended to me by Patricia, spent 3 weeks looking into Patrick's background. What she found was not dramatic. There was no criminal record, no prior fraud cases, no obvious red flags in the traditional sense. But there were some things worth knowing. He had significant debt, student loans from a graduate program he hadn't finished, credit card balances, a car loan. He had no significant savings. He had worked at 4 different companies in 8 years, never in a position of particular seniority. He had been briefly engaged once before to a woman 10 years older than him. That engagement had ended and she had relocated out of state shortly afterward. Dale couldn't find out more than that. I put all of it in the notebook. I did not go to Elise. The wedding was at a venue outside Bozeman, a place with mountain views and a big open-air pavilion. Elise had worked on it for months. It was beautiful. I helped her pick the flowers, approved the menu, addressed 240 envelopes by hand at my kitchen table. I was her mother. I was going to show up for her no matter what. What I hadn't told her was that Megan, Patricia, and I had spent 6 weeks preparing for what I hoped would not need to happen. The morning of the wedding, Elise texted me a photo of herself in her dress. She looked stunning. She looked like herself, like the girl who used to climb the apple tree in our backyard and refused to come down for dinner, like the woman who had held my hand at her father's funeral without a word. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at that photo for a long time. Then my phone buzzed again. A text from Megan. "It's happening. He just asked me to co-sign something. Bringing it to you now." She arrived at my hotel room 20 minutes later with a 2-page document. It was framed as a family investment agreement, a trust arrangement that would consolidate my property and investment accounts alongside Elise's future marital assets managed through a financial entity I had never heard of. There was a signature line for me and one for Megan. The language was dense and deliberately confusing. But Patricia had prepared me for exactly this kind of document. I recognized what it was designed to do: establish shared management over my estate, accessible to Elise's spouse. I photographed every page. I called Elise's spouse. I photographed every page. I called Dale. Then I texted my daughter. I wrote, "I need to see you, alone, before the ceremony. It's important, and I love you." She came to my room 10 minutes later in her dress, with her hair pinned up and a look on her face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I sat her down. I told her everything. I did not protect her from it because I had decided months ago that if it came to this, she deserved the whole truth. She listened without interrupting. Her face went very still. When I finished, I put Megan's document in her hands. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the table and said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Since October." She closed her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I loved you more than I needed to be right." She was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up, smoothed the front of her dress, and said, "I need a minute." She stepped into the bathroom. I heard water running. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. When she came out, her eyes were clear. She said, "I want to talk to him. I want to do this privately." before anyone else knows. Can you get Patricia here? We moved quickly. Patricia arrived within 30 minutes. She had been on standby. Megan joined us. We found Patrick in a small anteroom near the reception hall, adjusting his boutonniere in a mirror. He smiled when he saw us come in together. The smile faded. What followed was not dramatic in the way you might imagine. There was no shouting. Patrick tried at first to explain the document as a misunderstanding, a rough draft, something he'd meant to discuss more carefully. But Patricia had seen 100 versions of this, and she was calm and precise and relentless. She laid out, quietly, everything we knew. The questions going back to October, the call to my doctor, the approach to Megan, the document. He tried to reframe each thing. He was good at reframing, but Elise sat across from him and didn't say a word, and I watched him understand, slowly, that no reframe was going to work. In the end, Elise said 2 sentences. She said, "I think you should leave now." And then, "Don't contact me." He left. The guests were told there had been a family emergency. The caterers were extraordinarily gracious. Beverly, who had driven 3 hours to be there, held Elise's hand in the parking lot for 40 minutes while Megan and I handled the logistics of informing the venue. That night, the 4 of us, Elise, Megan, Beverly, and I, sat in Elise's hotel room and ordered room service and watched a movie she'd loved when she was 12. We didn't talk about Patrick or the wedding or what came next. We just sat together. Elise cried once near midnight. She didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. I just moved closer and put my arm around her. It's been 8 months now. Elise is doing what I've watched her do her whole life. She is getting through it by putting one foot in front of the other. She's back at work. She sees a therapist she likes. She called me last Sunday just to tell me about a patient she'd had who'd made surprising progress because she knew I'd want to hear something good. She's going to be fine. My estate is structured exactly as Gerald intended, protected and clear. The rental property is still occupied by the same family who just renewed their lease for another 2 years. My garden did well this summer, the tomatoes especially, which surprised me because I'd had a late frost in May and wasn't sure they'd recover. I think about what Gerald would say if he'd seen all of this. I think he would be proud of Megan for being willing to play a long game. I think he would be proud of Elise for her clarity in that anteroom, for saying exactly 2 sentences when 100 would have been easier. And I think he would look at me the way he used to when something had gone the way I'd predicted, and just nod. He would nod, and then he would probably suggest we celebrate with good coffee and something from the bakery downtown. So on the morning after the wedding that's exactly what I did. I drove to the bakery before it got crowded, and I ordered 2 of his favorites, and I brought them home and ate them at the kitchen table alone, in the quiet house I am not leaving, looking out at the garden. It was enough. It was more than enough. I caught it in the way he paused the first time I mentioned the rental property. I couldn't tell you exactly what I saw. Something behind the smile. Some small calibration. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but I had 30 years of watching students try to pretend they hadn't done something wrong, and I knew what it looked like when someone was filing information away. I chose to pay attention. I chose to be patient. I chose to be patient. I chose when the moment came, justice, and I chose my daughter. I would do it all again. I've thought a lot about what made the difference. Not the attorney, not the private investigator, not even the notebook I kept in my bedside drawer. Those were tools. What made the difference was a decision I made back in October, standing at my kitchen sink, replaying a dinner conversation that hadn't sat right, the decision to take my own discomfort seriously. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. People assume that with age comes a kind of softness, a willingness to overlook things for the sake of keeping peace. And maybe that's true for some people. But I spent 26 years in a classroom watching young people try to get away with things, and I learned that the cost of pretending not to notice is almost always higher than the cost of paying attention. Patrick counted on me being the kind of woman who would smooth things over. He had the right demographic and the wrong person. I don't think Patrick was born dishonest. I've thought about that too. He was a man in real debt, watching an opportunity arrange itself in front of him, and he made a series of choices that compounded, each one making the next easier to justify. That's how it usually works. Not a sudden fall, but a slow lean, one small rationalization at a time, until you're standing in an anteroom on what was supposed to be your wedding day, trying to explain a document you never expected anyone to read carefully. The consequences he faced weren't punishment handed down by some external force. They were simply the arrival of everything he'd set in motion. Actions accumulate. They always do. What I'm most proud of is not outmaneuvering him. It's that I protected Elise without taking the choice away from her. I gave her the truth, and I let her decide. She sat across from Patrick and said 2 sentences, and in those 2 sentences I saw everything Gerald and I had ever tried to give her: clarity, self-respect, the ability to walk away from something that looked like love but wasn't. You can't give your children those things by protecting them from hard moments. You can only give them by modeling it over and over until it becomes theirs. Megan's role in all of this is something I will never be able to adequately thank her for. She sat across from Patrick at dinner after dinner and kept her face open and pleasant while internally cataloging everything he said. That kind of sustained discipline, the ability to act against your own instincts in service of a longer goal, is not something you learn from a book. It's built slowly, through years of being asked to do hard things and doing them anyway. I keep coming back to something simple. Integrity is not what you do when the stakes are obvious. It's what you do in the small moments, when you think no one is watching and nothing is on the line yet. Patrick revealed himself in those small moments. The questions, the casual suggestions, the call to my doctor. And I revealed myself too, I hope, in the choices I made quietly, over months, without fanfare or witnesses. The right thing done privately is still the right thing. Maybe more so. Gerald's estate is intact. My garden is doing well. Elise called me last Sunday and she sounded like herself again, fully herself, not performing anything for anyone. That's the whole story. That's what it was all for.